Welcome, everyone, to another Keats-Shelley Association of America video interview. Thank you so much to all our followers and members for joining us and watching today. Remember, if you're not already a member of the Keats-Shelley Association of America, please do go to our website to find out how to join. It's k-aa.org/join. It starts at just $25 a year and includes a subscription to the Keats-Shelley Journal. But on to our recorded event today. Our communications fellow, Amy Wilcockson, will be interviewing the poet Laila Sumpton. Links to how to follow Laila, Amy, and the Keats-Shelley Association of America on Twitter are shared in the text to accompany this video. Laila's poetry uses imagery and lyricism to tell stories about identity and human rights. She studied English literature at the University of St Andrews and human rights at the University of London. She co-edited, quote, the book name is In Protest, 150 Poems for Human Rights, which is a unique anthology of global poetry collated by the Keats House Poets and the University of London's Human Rights Consortium. Laila is a Keats House Poet and a former Keats House Poet in residence. And as well as that, Amy will be asking her today about her ongoing project, Poetry Vs Colonialism. Amy Wilcockson is a PhD researcher at the University of Nottingham, editing the letters of the Scottish Romantic poet Thomas Campbell. And I'll pass over to Amy now to begin the interview. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you so much, Laila, for joining us today. I'm so excited to get to chat to you and hear a little bit more about everything that you've been getting up to. So I thought I'd start off by asking you just, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into writing poetry, and how you also started working alongside Keats House as a member of the Keats House Poets?
Yeah, sure. I'm delighted to be here talking to you both. Seen you both online in various different social media formats, so it's great to be on the same Zoom screen today. I always loved writing as a child. I was a dyslexic learner. I am dyslexic, and so I was probably the last person in my school to be able to read, something which I remember because I was told I was the last person to read. But I was always coming up with stories, and creative writing classes, as they were allowed then, was where I really thrived and enjoyed it. If you go to the careers officer, no one ever really tells you you can be a poet, or at least they didn't back then. Hopefully today they do. But I ended up working with a student poetry group at university, realised that there was this whole world of people who lived and did poetry, creating workshops, events, anthologies, competitions. And when I came to London after graduating from St Andrews, I was really keen to make sure that poetry was not just a hobby, but something that was my life, more than just a job, but a huge part of my life. And I graduated just before the London Olympics in 2012. And thankfully, there was some funding for cultural institutions to get young people into museums to engage with heritage. And so my timing was very lucky. I think it was 2010, and Keats House were using some of this Cultural Olympiad money to set up the Keats House Poets. And before that, they had not had a younger person's poetry group. It had more been a place to discuss the history, and of course there were poetry readings, but there wasn't a sort of a youth poetry element. And of course Keats House was the space where a young poet lived and worked and created some of his finest work. So I was really delighted to join this group. We were supported to put on our first events. We were given our first ever paid commissions. Supported to run heritage and poetry workshops, which was incredible, and that set us up as sort of like young experts in the poetry heritage area, because then Keats House would ring up another museum and say, hey, we've got some poets, London Transport Museum, do you want them? They can interpret your collections, and we'd get posted out to these different places. And the Keats House Poets is a brilliant group. They were my poetry home. Amongst them we have Simon Mole, Dean Atta, Deanna Rogers, Raymond Antrobus, Anthony Hett, Camille Ahmed, and we really sort of supported each other in those early days. And Keats House opened its doors to create free poetry afternoons every Sunday for a couple of years, hosted by the Keats House Poets. And it was a space where young people came from literally all over London, people of all ages as well, entering Keats House, a space that many people had never thought to visit before. And it was a really warm space to develop and perform poetry. And I guess that partnership has continued. I've run lots of workshops at the house for children, families, teenagers, adults. And when it came to the 200th anniversary, they announced the exciting opportunity of a shared residency split amongst the Keats House Poets. So that was my chance to write a commissioned poem and then also come up with my own project connected to the house. That was quite a long essay.
No, that was great. It all sounds so exciting, and what a kind of vibrant time to be at Keats House. I know we've spoken to Rob before, and he said how much kind of how useful and how exciting he found the Keats House Poets. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of what you did as poet in residence at Keats House? I know you've just said you were commissioned to write your own poetry, and you did workshops and things like that. Is there anything else that you kind of had to do as part of that role?
Yeah, so we all had the chance to decide what we wanted our residency to focus on. And I was setting up a project at the time called Poetry Vs Colonialism, looking at colonial history and seeing how poetry can investigate that and support people to learn more and question their own understanding and identity in terms of colonialism. And then I thought, oh, and I've also got this residency coming up at Keats House. And knowing a bit about the time at which Keats lived in, I was hoping that there would be some kind of even tenuous connection to colonialism, but I didn't really know. So I spoke to the staff at Keats House and basically gave them a list of items to search for in the collections. And then from that, I was hoping that we could tell a story of colonialism using objects in the collections. Not knowing really what we would find, just crossing my fingers. And I was interested in items that were connected to tea, which of course has a very deep colonial history, reaching into the Opium Wars, etc. And also cotton as well. And I knew that Fanny Brawns was a passionate dressmaker and very interested in fashion. So I was really hoping that there'd be some cotton sort of items as well. And I was just like, anything colonial, tell me what you've got. So it was really exciting to get the search results, albeit in lockdown. So there were lots of emails of pictures of things coming backwards and forwards, but still, this was a way I'd never thought about the house in all of my years working there. Like, I had the thought of looking at the collection from this perspective had not crossed my mind. So that was a fascinating thing to do.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I mean, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about this in a minute, but before I do, can you tell us a little bit more about Poetry Versus Colonialism and your kind of ongoing project with this? Why are you focusing on, I know you've got kind of 4 strands, I think, that you've been focusing on. So cotton, gold, tobacco and sugar. So why did you choose these 4 things? And kind of, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, Poetry Versus Colonialism came out of conversations I was having with friends and colleagues who work at Queen Mary's University of London and also Middlesex University, Dr. Penwoods and Dr. Vic Derijka. And we were thinking about how the syllabus could respond to tackling colonialism in a holistic way. And we were thinking that an interesting route would be to use literature. We know that there are ongoing battles around the history syllabus, and that will take time to change, but there is always the possibility of exploring history through the context of literature, and something which I think is so important to understand the world that you're reading about and the mindset of the poet or the novelist that you're looking at. And I had relatively little of that in my memory of literature at school. So we thought, why don't why don't we use poetry and creative writing as a way to explore colonial history? We could work with English and history teachers in a sort of cross-curricular way to explore that, and really also link in the sort of the present-day feelings about colonialism and how we interact with objects. So we thought a sort of a sensory way to engage with the history of colonialism would be through looking at objects that are very familiar to us. And of course, there are so many items that were traded across the empire. But we thought we'd start off with 4. And we thought of the sort of the sense of touch could be explored through cotton. Sight could be through gold. Tobacco, smell. And sugar, taste. And then we looked at the sort of histories. So cotton, we were looking at India and Bangladesh, though of course there's a link to sort of the enslaved Africans in America who were growing that cotton, which links up 2 colonial histories together. For gold, we were looking at the goldsmiths in Ghana, the Ashanti goldsmiths, and then the trade of gold as well. For tobacco, we were looking at West Virginia, and then for sugar, we're looking at mostly the Caribbean. So we're able to travel using very familiar items to people, and using poetry to really help children and students like dive into it using their senses, because you can make a really powerful connection, both personally and with audiences, when you involve the senses and try and see what emotions people already have towards these items and how you can use the feelings that we have to explore this history, rather than going through it in a sort of a historical bullet point kind of manner. So that was a really exciting, I mean, we could have picked so many topics, but those were the first 4. And I should say that the poets that we're working with on this Arts Council funded project are Keith Jarrett for sugar, Sandra A. Agard and Miriam Nash for tobacco, Nick McCullough for gold, and I'm doing cotton. And I particularly chose that one because of my Indian heritage and the fact that I've grown up with saris and shawls and salwar kameezes. I've been surrounded by fabrics and knew a bit about British colonialism in India, but really wanted to investigate that further.
Yeah, I mean, this all sounds, well, I say wonderful, but it sounds wonderful that, you're using these, as you say, normal everyday things to just really inspire children and students and sort of, let them know about this kind of more forgotten side of history, I guess, because I know when I started researching and looking at your project, I'd never thought about these things really in the way that you described. So it's making us adults, I guess, think again as well. So it's really wonderful stuff.
And it's about the legacy as well. So
yeah.
A lot of the sort of the patterns of sort of the abuse kind of angles of these trades are still continuing. If you look at the cotton industry today, if you look at gold mining, tobacco, I mean, the sort of the power structures were set up, and yes, of course, the geopolitics have changed to some extent, but a lot of those systems of oppression are still there, and the consumer is perhaps as willingly blind as they were in the time of Keats. That's an interesting question that we'd like people to think about.
Yeah, no, that sounds really inspiring, I think. Can you, going back to Keats House, I guess, as well, and how the 2 sort of link together, can you tell us more about the things that you found within the Keats House collections? I know you did a really cool workshop that I attended on the colonial kind of links in the collections. And then just to sort of build on that, how do you use poetry to kind of interpret these things? If that makes sense.
Spoke to the Keats House staff. They did a big search of their collections, both the items in the house and those that are kind of in storage at the London Metropolitan Archives. And in terms of the fabric materials, we have some fascinating pieces from Fanny Braun. A shawl, which looks like it has an Indian design on it. And there was a lot of mystery around whether it was muslin or cotton or gauze, whether it was from India or not. I spoke to a fashion historian, Sonia Ashmore, who's worked with the V&A, and she contacted her contacts showing them this picture of Fanny Brawne's shawl. Like, where is it from? And they reckon that it was probably made in Scotland in the sort of early 1800s, which was when British factories were beginning to weave cotton based on Indian designs and techniques, but using machines and copying the sort of very fine weave of muslin, but probably it was something closer to gauze. So that was one of the items. There was also a really beautiful like cream silk bodice, which shows you also just how petite Fanny Brawne was as well. There was a lot of her needlework, pieces of embroidery. The last piece she embroidered, which still actually has the needle in it. And then Georgiana Keats, Keats's sister-in-law, I think, yes. There are a lot of similar names, so you have to kind of tread carefully. So she emigrated to America, Ohio, I think, with Keats's brother. And there's her bonnet, a sort of a white cotton nightcap bonnet. That's also in the collections. There's a widow's bonnet as well. And then I was also interested in the history of Charles Brown, and he has several tea caddies, one of which is mahogany, another item crucial to the history of colonial trade. Then there's another one which is double whammy, tortoiseshell and ivory. So let's combine, let's not just have the tortoiseshell, let's have some ivory in there too. So that is a sort of a triple story of colonial trade, really, because you've got tea, ivory, tortoiseshell. So it was fascinating to investigate those three trades and the history of sort of, colonialism that intersects all of them. And then how this segues into what is something so crucial to British society now and then, tea drinking. I mean, a cup of tea tells a huge story. I'm sure Keats was writing about tea in his letters. We think of that era, we think of Jane Austen and the tea parties, but what we don't think about is the tea trade, and like I was mentioning before, the Opium Wars, and then the sort of tea espionage, where tea was stolen from, smuggled out of China and then planted in Assam, and how that really kind of fed the sort of the British Raj, as it was as well. So some really fascinating items there. And I guess, your challenge as a poet is to look at these items and help them speak to people. So to find out what historical stories are hidden there, and then to use the senses to investigate how you feel about it. I mean, we love personification as poets. It's always great to try and make these items speak back to us. And the Poetry Vs Colonialism poets are looking at heritage items in a range of museums and finding ways to create poems out as using these items as kind of springboards into the past, but also a reflection on our present understandings of these items too.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember in the workshop that you did, I attempted very, very poorly, I might add. I attempted my own sort of census poem from that, and I really enjoyed it. But speaking as someone who's done very, very little creative writing, and I'm pretty abysmal at it, I'd like to know a bit more about the kind of creative process behind your poems. Are there particular things that you use as inspiration? I guess obviously with the Poetry Vs Colonialism that there are, or is there something kind of a bit more random, like an object strikes you and then you just have to write about it? Like how do you write, I guess?
I guess it's all about interesting questions and interesting connections. So I think if you can just look at it at an object and think about what are the questions, what is the whole history connected to that item. So when I was looking at these tea caddies, I was doing lots of very random bits of research around the trade of tortoiseshell and the indigenous use of tortoiseshell, and then the sort of British-Spanish wars around the sort of Latin America, Caribbean area. And then you think about the sort of like sensory or emotional resonance of these items as well. Where do you hear about them in literature? Where do you sort of see photos of these items in the historic past? And you just sort of try and weave something together. You have a sense of the sort of images you want the reader to see and the story to tell. And then you connect to yourself and think about how do you feel about this? And either you sort of connect those images with a voice which is very much your own, or, which is quite fun, you can take a completely different voice. You can take the voice, the sort of colonial voice, and sort of, you know, create a sort of instruction manual on, you know, how to how to. So I think that's the interesting thing is, yeah, you have the sort of the facts you want to weave in there, you have the sort of sensory information, and then you need to think about what your voice is when you express that as well. But I think that's one of the sort of magic things about writing is you never really know how you're going to connect these kind of seemingly disparate bits of information about ivory, tortoiseshell and tea, and the various colonial histories connected to them, and you just find ways to like link the imagery, and it just sort of flows from there. You could workshop your way through it. You could give yourself a form to look at, like a list poem. You could do a found poem where you have a piece of historic text or an essay on this, and then you sort of pick your sort of words and phrases and create some sort of jigsaw piece from that. There's so many different ways, but I think it's always interesting questions and then sort of trying to use that multisensory information as well.
That's so exciting. A masterclass right there. I'll have to no, I will. I'll have to take all that on board and try and give my creative writing another go, clearly. I wondered, Laila, if you would mind either sharing with us a poem, perhaps, or some of your poetry, or talking us through one of your poems or something like that for us.
Yeah, sure. I'll share with you a poem which was inspired by the story of Fanny Braun's shawl. So this sort of very fine sort of white shawl with red Indian-style embroidery on it, which was done in the Jamdani style, a very sort of like very fine form of weaving from India, and the sort of kind of like muslin weaving that was done literally filled travellers and merchants with a sense of wonder. Like the Sufi poets of Mughal India wrote so many pieces about the magic of this material, and the names for this material are also sort of very sort of poetic. There's a type of weave which is called morning dew, because it would disappear. The dew would literally make it disappear if it was hung on a line in the morning dew. So the fabric already has this sort of fairy tale quality to it, and you can imagine sort of British merchants who've mostly been in very thick wool or linen their whole life suddenly finding this kind of like floaty, like almost see-through fabric and feeling like they're holding something magical. So I wanted to give it a sort of a fairy tale voice, so that was how I found the voice of the poem. And I wanted to like weave in some of the quotes from these Sufi poets who were writing about Jamdani and muslin, and tell the story of the beautiful sort of artisan work that was in India before colonialism happened. And this is a story that we're telling across all of the 4 chapters about the sort of the knowledge and the artistry before colonial boots kind of got there. And then part 2 of the story is the arrival of the British, and then it ends with the trade having begun, and with these items suddenly appearing at the kinds of balls that you would have read about in Jane Austen novels, which is something that people might be more familiar with if they've gone to school in the UK. And I think that was the thing that always struck me. There was that kind of disconnect when I was at school between the sort of the world of Jane Austen, the sort of the wealth that was being talked about, the beautiful fabrics, the new money, and there was never really any thought about where that new money was. Was it like, you know, someone just made really good cheese and got rich. Probably not. So I think that kind of that missing historical information, I felt like I wanted to express my sort of my disappointment at not having heard that, and that's, I guess, the motivation between poetry around poetry versus colonialism, is trying to fill in that gap for students. So this is Jamdani. Let me share my screen. There we go. And I should say that the image on the right is a print which belongs to Fanny Braun, and the other two images that you'll see are dresses from the period which are at the V&A. Jamdani. If I sing to you of Jamdani, of running water and evening dew, of muslin so fine it is breath on skin, caressing each curve in light. When Jamdani purred their fingers, they hungered for sunlit waters, for gowns that made their bearers float, for meadow mists that clung, and knew that 10 East India men simply would not do. All else is coarse when it sings on limbs, so it fell to that honourable crew of purveyors to sequester 48,000 Bengali weavers for their use alone. For the soirees demanded more, and the winter season at Bath had debutantes waiting to launch, whose dowries would jacket soldiers red and build the fleets needed for Jamdani quadrilles at the London summer balls. And if you have sugar in your tea, and gold on your fingers, and muslin on your skin, you, my dear, can go.
Thank you so much. That was such a beautiful reading. I got a bit like, no, I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. It was really, really great. Great to see what I guess you've been writing as part of Poetry Versus Colonialism and your residency at Keats House too. I wondered if you could finish basically by telling us kind of what's next for Poetry Versus Colonialism. I guess that the 2020 caused a bit of a stop on things that you've been getting up to. I know you wanted to do workshops and create teaching resources, taking your poetry into communities, reaching a whole range of people. So are you taking this forward in 2021? And also, what's next for you personally as a poet? What are your kind of aims, or what are you planning to do over the coming year or so?
Excellent, thank you. Well, yes, exactly. This year has been so difficult for schools, and the aim of Poetry Versus Colonialism has always been to work with academics, heritage sites, and also schools and teachers, particularly teacher training colleges as well. So we have some beautifully designed resources by our poets on gold, sugar, tobacco and cotton, which explore the history, and then also have poetry writing activities so the students can create their own responses. We're hoping that we will be running sessions with schools in September, a collection of schools in London, and then hopefully some schools in Birmingham as well. We'd love to develop these with students and teachers so we can work out what works best in the classroom, aiming at sort of around about year 7. We're also hoping to run a training workshop for heritage staff so that we can work with people who are trying to tell the colonial stories of their museums, and think about how we could use poetry to help visitors explore that and really connect. Not so that we just have feelings of pure anger or shame, but so we can really get deep into this history and understand what it means for us today. We also have plans to run a teacher training session with Middlesex University, so all the trainee teachers, so they can think about how they can use poetry to explore history, And so that, again, they can look at our resources and think about how they could apply them to the often ever-changing syllabus. And we're hoping to take our commissioned poems. You heard my own one about cotton. Nick McCower, Sandra A. Agard, Miriam Nash and Keith Jarrett have their own commissioned poems on their respective topics. And those are going to be published in a book alongside work from the students. So we're hoping that we'll have this beautiful anthology covering gold, tobacco, cotton and sugar. And I'm already getting interest from poets in Kenya saying, why don't you do tea? Work with Kenya. So ideally, we'd apply for some even more funding at some point and make this a global project, work with poets in colonized countries and take this to schools and see if we can expand this even further. Because I think this is something that needs to be global because the history is global. And it would be fascinating to really look deeply at the poetry of Keats in particular, and work out how we can tell stories of colonialism using the work of Keats. And I think that's something that I'm really looking forward to do with Keats House, so that we can look at his own life and the sort of the moments in his life where he almost joined the East India Company, and just the history that would have been definitely circling around him in terms of slavery and empire, and see how we can weave this into a resource that Keats House can use. And maybe, hopefully work with other museums to do the same, so that this doesn't need to be a part of history that we kind of put over here because it's just quite tricky and awkward, but something that really can be part of the context of how we understand writers from that period. In terms of my other work as a poet, I'm developing my own collection with the Arachne Press, also editing a collection of Black, Asian and minority ethnic poets and short story writers. And there's a play coming out next week, which we have 10 days to rehearse. So yes, lots of different projects happening. Very exciting that museums and schools are now beginning to open up more for projects and performances. So lots of exciting things on the way.
That all sounds absolutely amazing, and I for one can't wait to see what you personally and also Poetry and Colonialism do next, because it sounds unstoppable, and I think the work obviously needs to be done and shared globally, as you said. So yeah, thank you very much, Laila, for talking to us today. I've really enjoyed it. I know Anna has too. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's an honor to be here and to speak to you guys, and just really, really, really validating to know that this work is interesting and important, and exciting to work with you more.
Yeah, thank you, Laila. Thank you, Amy. That was a really, really insightful interview. And I just think, thank you for telling us all about your work, Laila, and providing that very moving reading of your poem. So I'm really honoured to be able to share that with the members of the Keats-Shelley Association of America, who I'm sure will continue to follow your work with great interest too. So we will make sure we share links to many of the things that Laila has talked about today. And thank you, Amy, for asking some great questions too.